Hello crafty friends, it's Alicia here with a project for Tailored Expressions. In today's video, I'll be using the new Shades of Summer colors to create a trio of thank you cards. For today's cards, I will be featuring the brand new cardstocks and inks from Tailored Expressions in Rock Candy, Pear, and Concord Grape. I'll also be using some sugar cube and oyster cardstock. For my focal points, I'll be using the abstract, branch, stamp, and stencil combo along with the coordinating die. I'll be adding some faux texture with the Splatter Background stamp and doing some die cutting with the stitched rectangle stacklets. For sentiments, I am going with the Simple Strips Thanks. I'll be able to get all these sentiments on one stamp, and I'll be die cutting them with the coordinating die. For stamping, I got out the exclusive TE Teal Misty, and I'll be heat embossing with Versamark ink and silver embossing powder. To help get a nice impression, I also got out the Just Press tool. I'll be using a variety of adhesives to hold everything together and some silver matte enamel dots for embellishing. Let's get crafty! I'm going to get started today by doing all of the stamping, and the first thing will be stamping and heat embossing the artistic branch on 3 pieces of sugar cube cardstock. I got the stamp set up in the center of my first piece of sugar cube, and once it was in place, I picked it up with the door of the Misty and I prepped my cardstock with the anti-static powder tool. This is going to help the powder only stick to where I want it. Once I had that done, I inked up my stamp, making sure to get it nice and juicy, and then I stamped it onto that first piece using the Just Press tool to make sure I had a good impression. Once that was stamped, I brought in the anti-static funnel tray and poured the embossing powder over that first impression. I did make sure to cover it well and tap off the excess. For now, I'm just going to sit that first one to the side and continue to stamp and pour the powder on the remaining 2 images. Once all 3 of those were done, I brought in the Sizzix heat tool and set that powder. I always like to let it warm up about 30 seconds before I bring it to the back a little bit and then bring it to the front and finish that melting. I always love the shine that embossing gives to an image. Once all 3 of those were heat set, I brought in the Simple Strips Thanks, and I followed pretty much the same steps to stamp and heat emboss my sentiments. Now on the Simple Strips stamps, you do want to make sure that you ink up the entire thing, even those little squares, because later you'll want those to help align the die. Off camera, I cut pieces of the new cardstocks down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and now we're going to add some faux texture to the background with some tone-on-tone stamping with the Splatter Background stamp. I'm going to get started with the pair-on-pair stamping, so I added a little adhesive to the back of my first piece and I placed that down on the pre-printed grid so that later I would know exactly where to put my next piece. Then I got my background stamp set up on top of that. I just put it face down, making sure all the edges were covered. Then I inked it up with that coordinating pear ink and got it stamped onto the cardstock. This is just a great easy way to add texture but keep it a little subtle as well. Before I move on to the next color, I did bring in a cloth and clean off the stamp. I want to make sure that I don't contaminate my new ink pads or have kind of an off-looking color onto that new cardstock. Once that was clean, I brought in the Rock Candy ink and the Rock Candy cardstock and did the same thing as with the first and repeated it for the third Concord Grape. Again, making sure to clean the stamp well in between each color. Now I'm going to add some color to my stamped branches with the coordinating layered stencils and all 3 colors. I'm going to get started by tacking down one of my stamped branches using those pre-printed grids on my paper placemat. Then I brought in stencil number 1, and for this I'm going to be using pear ink and a green blending brush. Once I had it set up, aligned as best as possible, I brought in some removable labeling tape and I made a hinge at the top. Now, this isn't going to stencil perfectly, it's more of an abstract look, so it's not completely filled in, but I did go ahead and bring in a pencil and made little marks on each of the corners. That way, when I go to place the second and third stencil, I have a good starting point to try to get them aligned. I did place another piece of that labeling tape at the bottom of the stencil just to make sure everything was held down securely. Then I used my green blending brush and the pear ink to cover each of the openings in the first stencil. Once I did have good coverage on that, I removed the first piece of cardstock, replaced it with the second, and then just placed my stencil right back on top of it and did the same thing for the third piece of cardstock as well. Once the pear ink had been added to all three pieces, I removed the stencil and the ink and then brought in layer number 2. To get started with the alignment, I did start with the pencil lines, but you might have to adjust it just a little bit each time. Then, when that was in place and all taped down, I brought in the rock candy ink and did the same thing. Now, one of the great things about these stencils is there are actually etched lines that help you line up where the stamp branch would be. Makes it nice and easy for aligning. I finished up using rock candy on all three of the pieces, and then I brought in the Concord grape and stencil number 3 and repeated the same steps. And here's a close-up look at the finished colored image. The next step for me was to do the die cutting, so I brought in the artistic branch die, the simple strips die, and I'm going to cut down those stamped colored cardstocks just a little bit with the largest die from the Stitch Rectangle Stacklet set. Here's a look at all of those pieces die cut. I know I have way more than the 3 sentiments I need, but I will hang on to these for future projects. I also use that stitched rectangle stacklet to cut 3 pieces of sugar cube for the inside of my cards. And now I'm going to add just a little bit of color to each one of those by kind of cleaning off each of my blending brushes along the bottom. This is a great way to use up the ink that's just sitting on the brush and add a little extra color to the inside of your cards. I created 3 top folding oyster card bases for today's cards, and I'm going to add those pieces that we just cleaned off the blending brushes onto the inside of each of the cards. Let me know in the comment section below how often you decorate the inside of your cards. I used to be an almost never, but here lately I've really enjoyed adding that extra touch. I brought back in my tone-on-tone stamped pieces, and now I'm going to add those to the front of each card base. It's really important if you do this that the color cardstock you put on the front is the color that you've added to the inside of the card. But if you use one of these tape runners like I do, it's an actual easy fix if you accidentally get it wrong. Now it's time to add the branches, and off camera I added some foam tape to the top few petals of each one. I want the top to pop up off the card, but I want to adhere the bottom or the stem down flat. Again, just to add some extra dimension. Once I pull the release paper from the back of each of the foam pieces, I'm going to bring in some Barely Art liquid glue and add some on top of each piece. What this does, it gives me a little wiggle time to make sure I have my branch exactly where I want it before I press it in place. After I do that, I use the same liquid glue to adhere down the stem and a couple of those leaves on the bottom. I adhered a branch to all 3 of the card fronts in this same way. You might have noticed that the top leaf and the one over on the right hang off the colored cardstock just a little bit, and that was intentional. Because the next thing I did was bring in a sentiment for each of my cards, which I had pre-put some foam sticky strips on the back, and I'm now going to place this to where the left hangs off of the cardstock just a little bit. This kind of balances everything out. Once again, I did use the liquid glue on top of the foam tape, so I had a little bit of wiggle time to get those nice and straight across. Now what I wanted to do to finish off the card was add a little bit more shine, so I brought in the silver matte enamel dots and I added 5 scattered around the front of each card. And here are some close-up looks at the finished trio. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch today's video. If you enjoyed the process, a thumbs up is appreciated. And if you're not already a subscriber, we do hope you'll click on the button below so you're the first to know about our latest videos. To find out more about the products I used today, you can check out the links in the description box below or visit the Tailored Expressions online store at tailoredexpressions.com.